On an NCIS episode called The Namesake, the murder weapon is traced to a pawn shop in Maryland. And so two of the agents, DiNozzo and Gibbs, the head agent, go there to trace it down and to find out more information about it. And while there, Tony DiNozzo notices a Congressional Medal of Honor given for valor in World War II that is there on display, given to a soldier named Leroy Jethro Moore. Now, Gibbs tries to run his life by a series of principles and rule number 39 is there is no such thing as a coincidence. And DiNozzo has absorbed this rule, and so he asks Gibbs, Leroy Jethro Gibbs, about the Medal of Honor given to Leroy Jethro Moore. It turns out that Leroy Jethro Moore and Gibbs' dad, Jackson, served in the military together, became best friends. They opened a store together after the war in Stillwater, Pennsylvania, and Jackson named his son after his best friend. I guess I should say former best friend, because not long after Gibbs' mother, after Jackson Gibbs' wife dies, Leroy Jethro Moore suddenly leaves town, and they never hear from him again. Leroy Jethro Gibbs' explanation, something must have happened between him and his dad. And he says, quote, "My bullheaded dad won't talk about it." Well, the 55th Psalm is a lament about lost friendship. It's notable for the intensity of the psalmist's distress. He is distraught. His heart is in anguish. The terrors of death, fear, trembling, and horror overwhelm. The psalmist is King David, and he is threatened by an enemy, although this psalm is not about an enemy. Quote, "It is not enemies who taunt me. I could bear that. It is you, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend." David has been betrayed by a friend. David has been sustained in his life by friends and friendship from early on. His best friend growing up was Jonathan, who was King Saul's son, and Jonathan helped save David's life by intervening when Saul was chasing David in a murderous rage. They developed a covenant of friendship, and that covenant ended only with Jonathan and his father Saul's death in battle. Power of friends. A part of the Catholic scriptures that is not a part of the Protestant scriptures is named Sirach. And in Sirach, we read about friends. Faithful friends are a sturdy shelter. Whoever finds one has found treasure. Faithful friends are beyond price. No amount can balance their worth. Faithful friends are life-saving medicine. And Sirach also writes about faithless friends. Is it not a sorrow like that for death itself when a dear friend turns into an enemy? King David would answer yes, and many of us would answer yes as well. Jesus describes his relationship to the disciples as one of friendship, and he is betrayed to death by one that he considers and treats as a friend, Judas, the one who dipped his hand in the bowl with bread with Jesus the night he was betrayed, to eat with as a companion, literally come-pan, to eat bread with. And that brings us back to King David, who is betrayed by my equal, my familiar friend, my companion, one whom I have eaten with. The more we studied this psalm on Wednesday and Thursday in Bible study, the more parallels we saw between the person who betrayed King David and his son Absalom. Absalom rebelled and betrayed and drove his father temporarily out of the kingship of Israel. We also noticed some similarities between the betrayer and Joab, who was the chief general of King David, who, despite specific orders from King David not to harm Absalom, went out and killed the rebellious Absalom. And so if it's either of those people or someone else, we know whoever the betrayer is someone in his inner circle. This is not an enemy out there. This is an enemy within the inner circle. This psalm invites us to spend some time with King David, not the king of Israel, not the great uniter of north and south kingdoms, not the great psalmist, not the ancestor of the Messiah. This psalm invites us to spend some time with King David, the human being, and to see from the inside out what it is like to be betrayed by a dear and close friend. The heart of the matter that we've been working through in August is another way of examining Jesus' great commandment, to love God with our whole heart and soul and mind and strength, and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And so the acronym HEART was developed to help remember how to do that. The H, of course, stands for heart. And in the scriptures, the heart is that part of us which is open to and aware of the holy, the really real part of life. The E is for emotional process, that instinctive part of us that often does its thing below the level of consciousness, which the Bible describes as soul. A is anxiety, when our soul and our mind overlaps, the mind being made up of our feelings and our thoughts together, and how we might be able to overcome the anxiety that threatens us in life. R is responsibility, the ability to choose how to respond to what happens to us in life, and that happens in the overlapping of mind and will, and in the Bible, will is referred to as strength. And then to love our neighbor as ourselves brings us to the T, and the word that has been chosen for that is triangle, and that would seem to be the occasion for some explanation how I can get from loving our neighbor as ourselves to triangles. Well, triangles are spontaneously forming and naturally occurring, observable, predictable groupings of three. And usually people, not always people, but groupings of three. They're as old as the Garden of Eden. If we read that story carefully, we see a series of interlocking triangles there. There's Adam and Eve and God. That's one grouping. There's Eve and the serpent and God. There's another grouping. There is Adam and the serpent and Eve. There's another grouping. Those are all triangles. They're naturally occurring, and they're as old as Genesis. They're as new as some of the newest discoveries in family dynamics. If you take three people who are connected to one another somewhat emotionally and hook them up to biofeedback monitors and just begin a conversation, you can see how the anxiety moves around among the three of them as that triangle, that group of three, changes its shape over time. There's lots of explanations for triangles. One is a practical explanation that any two people in and of themselves is an inherently unstable grouping. And so to be able to balance that, to be able to get a little bit of stability, one or both of them automatically reaches out to a third and stabilizes through a triangle. Theologically speaking, we're created in the image of God, are we not? Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one God in three persons. And so it makes sense why, at the instinctive level, we would sense and we would try to group ourselves in groups of three, the residue of the Trinity, if you will, in creation. There's examples everywhere. If you think about it, let's say you and your spouse go away for a vacation and you're there for a week or so, and just at that point in having a little bit too much togetherness and getting on each other's nerves, and you meet a new couple, and so you invite them out to dinner. You have a great conversation. The conversation flows, and then when that other couple leaves, you can talk about them, either good or bad. That's a triangle. That's a triangle. Or you're in a coffee shop or a sports bar, and you're ready to have a conversation. You really don't know anything about the person next to you, but you notice that he is also watching the same sports channel that you're watching, and you discover that you have interest in the same team, and so you spend the rest of the evening together chatting about how bad the manager is for the team that you follow. That's a triangle. They happen all the time. Oftentimes they're two against one. In the Garden of Eden story, the serpent triangles himself in between Eve and God and tries to draw closer to God, to Eve, by pushing God farther away, and does so by creating some doubt in Eve's mind about the goodness of God. Can you really trust God's motives, Eve? And so the serpent and Eve draw closer together as they push God farther away. In the story of King David, his son Absalom rebels after a very long, careful time of preparation. He positions himself on the steps of the palace, and whenever anyone comes out after having an audience with the king and things have not gone very well, Absalom calls that person aside and says, if I were king, you'd have got a different outcome. Things would have been better. That's two against one. They happen all the time. After a stressful time at work, maybe with a boss or maybe with a customer, you're so frustrated that you find yourself venting to another person that you work with, and that person takes your side and agrees with you that you were right and the other person was wrong. And maybe they say something that makes you laugh. And even though you'd never felt really close to this person before, you certainly do now. That's a triangle, two against a third. In this year's political campaigns, the two against one triangles are being used very effectively, especially at the presidential level, as candidates try to draw closer to their voters by focusing on them, whoever them is, maybe the Mexicans or the Chinese or the Wall Street bankers or the rich. But it, in that triangle, draws the candidate and the potential voter closer together as they agree that the problem is way out there somewhere and certainly not here with us. That's a triangle. So how do we love our neighbor as ourselves in the midst of these naturally occurring groupings of three? Well, it seems that one thing we can do is recognize them, that they are natural, and if you pay attention, you can see them everywhere you look, and that we're a part of them. And since they are natural, they're not necessarily good or bad. It's how we function in them that makes the difference. And so we recognize them, and then we remain in them, especially when you're the point, when the other two are against you, you kind of want to get out of town as quickly as you can. That's what David says here when he says, "Oh, that I had wings like a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. I'd be out of here. I would want to get away." He said in a triangle, one friend has harmed another friend, and here's David in the middle, not knowing what to do. "Oh, I just wish I could get away." When the children were younger and things were not going well somewhere or another, maybe at church or whatever, or in culture, I would say to Lisa, "Can't we just move to Montana and homeschool the kids?" You know, that's moving away. That's wanting to get away. And whenever we're in a triangle like that, that's the first thing we want to do. And so we recognize that King David didn't have wings, neither do we, so we can't fly away. So we remain, and this is the really hard part. If we're going to live in these things, we remain, and we remain as neutral as we can. And isn't that hard when two of our friends have something going on between them, or two of our children, or a spouse and a child, however we want to think about it? There's something going on between two people we care about, and we want to run in there and fix it. And yet most of us have had enough experience in life to know that we can't do that. The Proverbs puts it this way: like somebody who takes a passing dog by the ears is the one who meddles in the quarrel of another. It's a good way of describing what happens when we try to fix something going on between two other people. 3 verses later, the proverb says, "Without wood a fire goes out, without gossip a quarrel dies down." And so how do we remain connected to those people in our lives when things maybe are not going well between them, without gossiping and without quarreling and all that? It's hard. This goes in the category of easier said than done. And yet when it is done, important things can happen. In the 1970s, 1973, the nation of Egypt invaded the nation of Israel on Israel's high holy day of Yom Kippur. And yet less than 5 years after that, President Jimmy Carter has the head of Israel and the head of Egypt together at Camp David trying to negotiate an accord. There's a triangle for you, isn't it? The United States and Israel and Egypt, these two bitter enemies. And one of the reasons I think they're able to negotiate this lasting peace is because the president doesn't solve the problems for them. He keeps pushing them, encouraging them. You two can work this out. And so Sadat and Begin, the prime ministers of Egypt and Israel, do work it out, and they sign the Camp David Accords, and those have lasted for almost 4 decades now. These ancient bitter enemies have not gone to war against one another in almost 40 years. That's what can happen when we remain in a triangle and remain neutral as best we can. Well, that's kind of a cosmic scale, and so we turn to fiction to learn how we might do it on a day-to-day basis. The triangle in NCIS between Leroy Jethro Gibbs and Leroy Jethro Moore and Jackson Gibbs. You can sense, if you know anything about the series, that Gibbs, the NCIS agent, wants to side with one, probably not his dad, as his relationship is. But he works really hard to remain in that triangle and to remain neutral. He tracks down his namesake living in a senior home and goes to see him. And after a little bit of pleasantries at the beginning, he begins to talk about the unspoken issue. He says, you haven't asked about my father. And he pauses and he doesn't say anything. He's still alive. Pause, no response. He's not changed much. He still has the store. And again, after waiting and not hearing any response, he says, why did you leave Stillwater? And Leroy Jethro Moore says, well, I'm sure your father and I have different versions of what happened. And then he stops there. And as we know, when two people are together and the relationship starts getting uncomfortable, a third is triangled in. And so Leroy Jethro Moore suddenly remembers there's a poker game every afternoon at the senior center. And he says, if I don't referee, a fight's likely to break out. So he leaves and goes to the poker game. So Gibbs goes back to his dad and says, what happened between you and LJ? And his dad says, he killed your mother, Jethro, which is a pretty strong statement. And he goes on to explain that your mother was in pain from terminal cancer. She confided in LJ that she was going to overdose, and he didn't stop her. And he didn't tell me. She had time left, Jethro, and I wanted every minute of it. So the next day, Leroy Jethro Gibbs goes to see the namesake, who says, I don't dispute what your father said, Jethro. I couldn't bear the thought of her father and her son, of her husband and her son, watching her go through months of debilitating agony. And then, as Paul Harvey used to say, there's the rest of the story. In high school, your father and I were both in love with your mother. Now, Leroy Jethro Moore never asked out the mother because he was black and she was white, and that wasn't done in the 1940s in Pennsylvania. In the closing scene, Gibbs gets them together, and he brings Moore home to see his dad and announces, time to end the feud. All of us have one thing in common. We all loved the same woman. He said, you're not getting any younger. Work it out. And then he leaves. And they do work it out because it's Hollywood. And they work it out before the credits roll at the end of the story, obviously. Well, life doesn't have many Hollywood endings like that, and yet life can have some pretty good endings and beginnings and transitionings because God is at work in us and through us, and sometimes despite us, God is at work to get God's work done. The heart of the matter is that we're called to love God with our whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. And we're called to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, even when it's hard to love our neighbors, and even when it's hard to love ourselves, and even when it's hard to love God. And it is in the strength and the power of that triangle, the most important triangle in life, God and neighbor and self, that we can find the courage to love when the going gets tough. Make it so, God, in you and in me and in us together forever. Let's pray. God, we thank you that in the ancient story of David and in modern television fiction that we can learn truth and reality about life. Help us to think carefully about what it means to love you with all of who we have, not holding anything back like the psalmist didn't hold anything back. And help us to understand what it means to love you and to love our neighbor when it seems that our neighbor is not lovable, and to love ourselves in those times when we don't seem lovable either. And yet it is your powerful, overwhelming, amazing, graceful love that makes that possible. Help us to do that in every situation in which we find ourselves as best we can. For it is in the name and in the Spirit of Christ that we pray. Amen.